really good jazz piano. Because of the midnight noise on both ends of the line, there was some confusion at Harry's New York bar when the call came through. All the bartender could tell at first was that it was a long distance call from Khan, evidently from some kind of nightclub, and the operator's frantic voice made it sound like an emergency. Then at last, by plugging his free ear and shouting questions into the phone, he learned that it was only Ken Platt, calling up to have an aimless chat with his friend Carson Weiler, and this made him shake his head in exasperation as he set the phone on the bar beside Carson's glass of Pernod. "Here," he said, "it's for you, for God's sake. It's your buddy." Like a number of other Paris bartenders, he knew them both pretty well. Carson was the handsome one, the one with the slim, witty face and the English-sounding accent. Ken was the fat one who laughed all the time and tagged along. They were both 3 years out of Yale and trying to get all the fun they could out of living in Europe. "Carson," said Ken's eager voice, vibrating painfully in the receiver. "This is Ken. I knew I'd find you there. Listen, when you coming down anyway?" Carson puckered his well-shaped brow at the phone. "You know when I'm coming down," he said. "I wired you. I'm coming down Saturday. What's the matter with you?" "Hell, nothing's the matter with me. Maybe a little drunk is all." "No, but listen, what I really called up about, there's a man here named Sid, plays a really good jazz piano, and I want you to hear him. He's a friend of mine. Listen, wait a minute. I'll get the phone over close so you can hear. Listen to this now. Wait a minute." There were some blurred scraping sounds and the sound of Ken laughing and somebody else laughing, and then the piano came through. It sounded tinny in the telephone, but Carson could tell it was good. It was Sweet Lorraine, done in a rich, traditional style with nothing commercial about it. And this surprised him, for Ken was ordinarily a poor judge of music. After a minute, he handed the phone to a stranger he had been drinking with, a farm machinery salesman from Philadelphia. "Listen to this," he said. "This is first rate." The farm machinery salesman held his ear to the phone with a puzzled look. "What is it?" "Sweet Lorraine." "No, but I mean, what's the deal? Where's it coming from?" "Con. Somebody Ken turned up down there. You've met Ken, haven't you?" "No, I haven't," the salesman said, frowning into the phone. "Here, it's stopped now, and somebody's talking. You better take it." "Hello? Hello?" Ken's voice was saying. "Carson?" "Yes, Ken, I'm right here." "Where'd you go? Who was that other guy?" "That was a gentleman from Philadelphia named—" He looked up questioningly. "Baldinger," said the salesman, straightening his coat. "Named Mr. Baldinger. He's here at the bar with me." "Oh, well, listen. How'd you like Sid's playing?" "Fine, Ken. Tell him I said it was first rate." "You want to talk to him? He's right here. Wait a minute." There were some more obscure sounds, and then a deep middle-aged voice said, "Hello there." "How do you do, Sid? My name's Carson Weiler, and I enjoyed your playing very much." "Well," the voice said, "thank you. Thank you a lot. I appreciate it." It could have been either a black or a white man's voice, but Carson assumed he was black, mostly from the slight edge of self-consciousness or pride in the way Ken had said. "He's a friend of mine. I'm coming down to Cannes this weekend," said Sid, Carson said, "and I'll be looking forward to—" But Sid had evidently given back the phone, for Ken's voice cut in. "Carson? What? Listen, what time you coming Saturday? I mean, what train and everything?" They had originally planned to go to Cannes together, but Carson had become involved with a girl in Paris, and Ken had gone on alone with the understanding that Carson would join him in a week. Now it had been nearly a month. "I don't know the exact train," Carson said, with some impatience. "It doesn't matter, does it? I'll see you at the hotel sometime Saturday." "Okay. Oh, and wait, listen. The other reason I called. I want to sponsor Sid here for the IBF, okay?" "Right. Good idea. Put him back on." And while he was waiting, he got out his fountain pen and asked the bartender for the IBF membership book. "Hello again," Sid's voice said. "What's this I'm supposed to be joining here?" "The IBF," Carson said. "That stands for International Barflies. Something they started here at Harry's back in, I don't know, a long time ago. Kind of club." "Very good," Sid said, chuckling. "Now what It amounts to is this, Carson began, and even the bartender for whom the IBF was a bore and a nuisance had to smile with pleasure at the serious, painstaking way he told about it. How each member received a lapel button bearing the insignia of a fly, together with a printed booklet that contained the club rules and a listing of all other IBF bars in the world. How the cardinal rule was that when two members met, they were expected to greet one another by brushing their fingers of their right hands on each other's shoulders and saying bzz, bzz. This was one of Carson's special talents, the ability to find and convey an unashamed enjoyment in trivial things. Many people could not have described the IBF to a jazz musician without breaking off in an unapologetic laugh to explain that it was, of course, a sort of sad little only tourist. A squares thing, really, and that its very lack of sophistication was what made it fun. Carson told it straight. In much the same way he had once made it fashionable among some of the more literary undergraduates at Yale to spend Sunday mornings respectfully absorbed in the funny papers of the New York Mirror. More recently, the same trait had rapidly endeared him to many chance acquaintances, notably to his current girl, the young Swedish art student for whom he had stayed in Paris. "You have beautiful taste in everything," she had told him on their first memorable night together. "You have a truly educated, truly original mind." "Got that?" he said into the phone, and paused to sip his Bernard. "Right. Now, if you'll give me your full name and address, Sid, I'll get everything organized on this end." Sid spelled it out, and Carson lettered it carefully into the membership book, with his own name and Ken's as co-sponsors, while Mr. Baldinger watched. When they were finished, Ken's voice came back to say a reluctant goodbye, and they hung up. "That must have been a pretty expensive telephone call," Mr. Baldinger said, impressed. "You're right," Carson said. "I guess it was. What's the deal on this membership book anyway? All this barfly business." "Oh, aren't you a member, Mr. Baldinger? I thought you were a member. Here, I'll sponsor you if you like." Mr. Baldinger got what he later described as an enormous kick out of it. Far into the early morning, he was still sidling up to everyone at the bar, one after another, and buzzing them. Carson didn't get to Cannes on Saturday, for it took him longer than he'd planned to conclude his affair with the Swedish girl. He had expected a tearful scene, or at least a brave exchange of tender promises and smiles, but instead she was surprisingly casual about his leaving, even abstracted, as if already concentrating on her next truly educated, truly original mind. And this forced him into several uneasy delays that accomplished nothing except to fill her with impatience, and him with a sense of being dispossessed. He didn't get to Cannes until the following Tuesday afternoon, after further telephone talks with Ken, and then, when he eased himself onto the station platform, stiff and sour with hangover, he was damned if he knew why he'd come at all. The sun assaulted him, burning deep into his gritty scalp and raising a quick sweat inside his rumpled suit. It struck blinding glints off the chromework of parked cars and motor scooters and made sickly blue vapors of exhaust rise up against pink buildings. It played garishly among the swarm of tourists who jostled him, showing him all their pores, all the tension of their store-new sports clothes, their clutched suitcases and slung cameras, all the anxiety of their smiling, shouting mouths. Cannes would be like any other resort town in the world, all hurry and disappointment. And why hadn't he stayed where he belonged, in a high, cool room with a long-legged girl? Why the hell had he let himself be coaxed and wheedled into coming here? But then he saw Ken's happy face bobbing in the crowd. "Carson!" And there he came, running in his overgrown fat boy's thigh-chafing way, clumsy with welcome. "Taxi's over here. Take your bag, boy. Do you look beat? Get you a shower and a drink first, okay? How the hell are you?" And riding light on the taxi cushions as they swung onto the croisette, with its spectacular blaze of blue and gold and its blood-quickening rush of sea air, Carson began to relax. Look at the girls. There were acres of them. And besides, it was good to be with old Ken again. It was easy to see now that the thing in Paris could only have gotten worse if he'd stayed. He had left just in time. Ken couldn't stop talking. Pacing in and out of the bathroom while Carson took his shower, jingling a pocket full of coins, he talked in the laughing, full-throated joy of a man who has gone for weeks without hearing his own voice. The truth was that Ken never really had a good time away from Carson. They were each other's best friends, but it had never been an equal friendship, and they both knew it. At Yale, Ken would probably have been left out of everything if it hadn't been for his status as Carson's dull but inseparable companion. And this was a pattern that nothing in Europe had changed. What was it about Ken that put people off? Carson had pondered this question for years. Was it just that he was fat and physically awkward, or that he could be strident and silly in his eagerness to be liked? But weren't these essentially likable qualities? No. Carson guessed the closest he could come to a real explanation was the fact that when Ken smiled, his upper lip slid back to reveal a small, moist inner lip that trembled against his gum. Many people with this kind of mouth may find it no great handicap. Carson was willing to admit that, but it did seem to be the thing everyone remembered most vividly about Ken Platt, whatever more substantial sounding reasons one might give for avoiding him. In any case, it was what Carson himself was always most aware of, in moments of irritation. Right now, for example, in the simple business of trying to dry himself and comb his hair and put on fresh clothes, this wide-moving, double-lipped smile kept getting in his way. It was everywhere, blocking his reach for the towel rack, hovering too close over his jumbled suitcase, swimming in the mirror to eclipse the tying of his tie, until Carson had to clamp his jaws tight to keep from yelling, "All right, Ken, shut up now." But a few minutes later they were able to compose themselves in the shaded silence of the hotel bar. The bartender was peeling a lemon, neatly pinching and pulling back a strip of its bright flesh between thumb and knife blade, and the fine citric smell of it, combining with the scent of gin and the faint smoke of crushed ice, gave flavor to a full restoration of their ease. A couple of cold martinis drowned the last of Carson's peak, and by the time they were out of the place and swinging down the sidewalk on their way to dinner, he felt strong again, with a sense of the old camaraderie, the familiar, buoyant wealth of Ken's admiration. It was a feeling touched with sadness, too, for Ken would soon have to go back to the States. His father in Denver, the author of sarcastic weekly letters on business stationery, was holding open a junior partnership for him, and Ken, having long since completed the Sorbonne courses that were his ostensible reason for coming to France, had no further excuse for staying. Carson, luckier in this as in everything else, had no need of an excuse. He had an adequate private income and no family ties. He could afford to browse around Europe for years, if he felt like it, looking for things that pleased him. "You're still white as a sheet," he told Ken across their restaurant table. "Haven't you been going to the beach?" "Sure." Ken looked quickly at his plate. "I've been to the beach a few times. The weather hasn't been too good for it lately is all." But Carson guessed the real reason that Ken was embarrassed to display his body, so he changed the subject. "Oh, by the way," he said, "I brought along the IBF stuff for that piano player friend of yours." "Oh, swell." Ken looked up in genuine relief. "I'll take you over there as soon as we're finished eating, okay?" And as if to hurry this prospect along, he forked a dripping load of salad into his mouth and tore off too big a bite of bread to chew with it, using the remaining stump of bread to mop at the oil and vinegar in his plate. "You'll like him, Carson," he said soberly around his chewing. "He's a great guy. I really admire him a lot." He swallowed with effort and hurried on. "I mean, hell, with talent like that he could go back to the States tomorrow and make a fortune, but he likes it here. One thing, of course, he's got a girl here, this really lovely French girl, and I guess he couldn't very well take her back with him." "No, but really, it's more than that. People accept him here. As an artist, I mean, as well as a man. Nobody condescends to him, nobody tries to interfere with his music, and that's all he wants out of life. Well, I mean, he doesn't tell you all this, probably be a bore if he did. It's just a thing you sense about him. Comes out in everything he says, his whole mental attitude." He popped the soaked bread into his mouth and chewed it with authority. "I mean, the guy's got authentic integrity," he said. "Wonderful thing." Did sound like a damn good piano, Carson said, reaching for the wine bottle, what little I heard of it. Wait till you really hear it, though. Wait till he really gets going. They both enjoyed the fact that this was Ken's discovery. Always before it had been Carson who led the way, who found the girls and learned the idioms and knew how best to spend each hour. It was Carson who had tracked down all the really colorful places in Paris where you never saw Americans, and who then, just when Ken was learning to find places of his own, had paradoxically made Harry's bar become the most colorful place at all, of all. Through all this, Ken had been glad enough to follow, shaking his grateful head in wonderment. But it was no small thing to have turned up an incorruptible jazz talent in the back streets of a foreign city all alone. It proved that Ken's dependence could be less than total after all, and this reflected credit on them both. The place where Sid played was more of an expensive bar than a nightclub, a small carpeted basement several streets back from the sea. It was still early, and they found him having a drink alone at the bar. "Well," he said when he saw Ken. "Hello there." He was stocky and well-tailored, a black man with a pleasant smile, full of strong white teeth. "Sid, I'd like you to meet Carson Weiler. You talked to him on the phone that time, remember?" "Oh, yes," Sid said, shaking hands. "Oh, yes, very pleased to meet you, Carson. What are you gentlemen drinking?" They made a little ceremony of buttoning the IBF insignia into the lapel of Sid's tan gabardine, of buzzing his shoulder and offering the shoulders of their own identical seersucker jackets to be buzzed in turn. "Well, this is fine," Sid said, chuckling and leafing through the booklet. "Very good." Then he put the booklet in his pocket, finished his drink, and slid off the bar stool. "And now, if you'll excuse me, I gotta go to work." "Not much of an audience yet," Ken said. Sid shrugged. "Place like this, I'd just as soon have it that way. You get a big crowd, you always get some square asking for Deep in the Heart of Texas or some damn thing." Ken laughed and winked at Carson, and they both turned to watch Sid take his place at the piano, which stood on a low spotlighted dais across the room. He fingered the keys idly for a while to make stray phrases and chords, a craftsman fondling his tools, and then he settled down. The compelled beat emerged, and out of it the climb and waver of the melody, an arrangement of "Baby Won't You Please Come Home." They stayed for hours, listening to Sid play and buying him drinks whenever he took a break, to the obvious envy of other customers. Sid's girl came in, tall and brown-haired with a bright, startled-looking face that was almost beautiful, and Ken introduced her with a small, uncontrollable flourish. "This is Jacqueline." She whispered something about not speaking English very well, and when it was time for Sid's next break, the place was filling now, and there was considerable applause when he finished. The four of them took a table together. Ken let Carson do most of the talking now. He was more than content just to sit there, smiling around this table full of friends with all the serenity of a well-fed young priest. It was the happiest evening of his life in Europe, to a degree that even Carson would never have guessed. In the space of a few hours, it filled all the emptiness of his past month, the time that had begun with Carson saying, "Go then. Can't you go to Cannes by yourself?" It atoned for all the hot miles walked up and down the Croisette on blistered feet to peek like a fool at girls who lay incredibly near naked in the sand. For the cramped, boring bus rides to Nice and Monte Carlo and St. Paul de Vence for the day, he had paid a sinister druggist 3 times too much for a pair of sunglasses, only to find, on catching sight of his own image in the gleam of a passing shop window, that they made him look like a great blind fish. For the terrible daily, nightly sense of being young and rich and free on the Riviera, and of having nothing to do. Once in the first week he had gone with a prostitute whose canny smile, whose shrill insistence on a high price, and whose facial flicker of distaste at the sight of his body had frightened him into an agony of impotence. Most other nights he had gotten drunk or sick from bar to bar, afraid of prostitutes and of rebuffs from other girls, afraid even of striking up conversations with men lest they mistake him for a fairy. He had spent a whole afternoon in the French equivalent of a dime store, feigning a shopper's interest in padlocks and shaving cream and cheap tin toys. moving through the bright, stale air of the place with a throat full of longing for home. 5 nights in a row he had hidden himself in the protective darkness of American movies, just as he'd done years ago in Denver to get away from boys who called him Lord S. Platt. And after the last of these entertainments back in the hotel with the taste of chocolate cream still cloying in his mouth, he had cried himself to sleep. But all this was dissolving now, under the fine, reckless grace of Sid's piano, under the spell of Carson's intelligent smile and the way Carson raised his hands to clap each time the music stopped. Sometime after midnight, when everyone but Sid had drunk too much, Carson asked him how long he had been away from the States. "Since the war," he said. "I came over in the army and I never did go back." Ken, coated with a film of sweat and happiness, thrust his glass high in the air for a toast. "And by God, here's hoping you never have to, Sid." "Why is that, have to?" Jacqueline said. Her face looked harsh and sober in the dim light. "Why do you say that?" Ken blinked at her. "Well, I just mean, that he never has to sell out or anything. He never would, of course." "What does that mean, sell out?" There was an uneasy silence until Sid laughed in his deep, rumbling way. "Take it easy, honey," he said, and turned to Ken. "We don't look at it that way, you see. Matter of fact, I'm working on angles all the time to get back to the States, make some money there. We both feel that way about it." "Well, but you're doing it all right here, aren't you?" Ken said, almost pleading with him. "You're making enough money and everything, aren't you?" Sid smiled patiently. "I don't mean a job like this, though, you see. I mean real money." "You know who is Murray Diamond?" Jacqueline inquired, holding her eyebrows high, "the owner of nightclubs in Las Vegas?" But Sid was shaking his head and laughing. "Honey, wait a minute. I keep telling you there's nothing to count on. Murray Diamond happened to be in here the other night, you see," he explained. "Didn't have much time, but he said he'd try to drop around again some night this week. Be a big break for me. Of course, like I say, that's nothing to count on." "Well, but Jesus, Sid." Ken shook his head in bafflement. Then, letting his face tighten into a look of outrage, he thumped the table with a bouncing fist. "Why prostitute yourself?" he demanded. "I mean, damn it, you know they'll make you a prostitute yourself in the States." Sid was still smiling, but his eyes had narrowed slightly. "I guess it's all in the way you look at it," he said. And the worst part of it, for Ken, was that Carson came so quickly to his rescue. "Oh, I'm sure Ken doesn't mean that the way it sounds," he said, and while Ken was babbling apologies of his own, "No, of course not. All I meant was, He went on to say other things, light, nimble things that only Carson would say until the awkwardness was gone. When the time came to say goodnight, there were handshakes and smiles and promises to see each other soon. But the minute they were out on the street, Carson turned on Ken. "Why did you have to get so damned sophomoric about that? Couldn't you see how embarrassing it was?" "I know," Ken said, hurrying to keep pace with Carson's long legs. "I know, but hell, I was disappointed in him, Carson. The point is, I never heard him talk like that before." What he omitted here, of course, was that he had never really heard him talk at all, except in the one shy conversation that had led to the calling up of Harry's bar that other night, after which Ken had fled back to the hotel in fear of overstaying his welcome. "Well, but even so," Carson said, "don't you think it's the man's own business what he wants to do with his life?" "Okay," Ken said. "Okay, I told him I was sorry, didn't I?" He felt so humble now that it took him some minutes to realize that, in a sense, he hadn't come off too badly. After all, Carson's only triumph tonight had been that of the diplomat, the soother of feelings. It was he, Ken, who had done the more dramatic thing. Sophomoric or not, impulsive or not, wasn't there a certain dignity in having spoken his mind that way? Now, licking his lips and glancing at Carson's profile as they walked, he squared his shoulders and tried to make his walk less of a waddle and more of a headlong, manly stride. "It's just that I can't help how I feel, that's all," he said with conviction. "When I'm disappointed in a person, I show it, that's all. All right, let's forget it." And Ken was almost sure, though he hardly dared believe it, that he could detect a grudging respect in Carson's voice. Everything went wrong the next day. The fading light of afternoon found the two of them slumped and staring in a bleak working man's cafe near the railroad station, barely speaking to each other. It was a day that had started out unusually well, too. That was the trouble. They had slept till noon and gone to the beach after lunch. For Ken didn't mind the beach when he wasn't alone, and before long they had picked up two American girls in the easy, graceful way that Carson always managed such things. One minute the girls were sullen strangers wiping scented oil on their bodies and looking as if any intrusion would mean a call for the police. The next minute they were weak with laughter at the things Carson was saying, moving aside their bottles and their zippered blue TWA satchels to make room for unexpected guests. There was a tall one for Carson with long, firm thighs, intelligent eyes, and a way of tossing back her hair that gave her a look of real beauty, and a small one for Ken, a cute, freckled, good sport of a girl whose cheerful glance and gesture showed she was used to taking second best. Ken, bellying deep into the sand with his chin on two stacked fists, smiled up very close to her warm legs, felt almost none of the conversational tension that normally hampered him at times like this. Even when Carson and the tall girl got up to run splashing into the water, he was able to hold her interest. She said several times that the Sorbonne must have been fascinating, and she sympathized with his having to go back to Denver, though she said it was probably the best thing. "And your friend's just going to stay over there here indefinitely then?" she asked. "Is it really true what he said? I mean that he isn't studying or working or anything, just sort of floating around?" "Well, yeah, that's right." Ken tried a squinty smile like Carson's own. "Why?" "It's interesting. That's all. I don't think I've ever met a person like that before." That was where Ken began to realize what the laughter and the scanty French bathing suits had disguised about these girls. That they were girls of a kind neither he nor Carson had dealt with for a long time. Suburban, middle class girls who had dutifully won their parents' blessing for this guided tour. Girls who said, "Golly Moses," whose campus shop clothes and hockey field strides would have instantly betrayed them on the street. They were the very kind of girls who had gathered at the punch bowl to murmur, "Oh," at the way he looked in his first tuxedo, whose ignorant, maddeningly bland little stares of rejection had poisoned all his aching years in Denver and New Haven. They were squares. And the remarkable thing was that he felt so good. Rolling his weight to one elbow, clutching up slow, hot handfuls of sand and emptying them, again and again, he found his flow of words coming quick and smooth. "No, really, there's a lot to see in Paris. Shame you couldn't spend more time there. Actually, most of the places I like best are more or less off the beaten track. Of course, I was lucky in having a fairly good grasp of the language. And then I met so many congenial." He was holding his own. He was making out. He hardly even noticed when Carson and the tall girl came trotting back from their swim, as lithe and handsome as a couple in a travel poster, to drop beside them in a bustle of towels and cigarettes and shuddering jokes about how cold the water was. His only mounting worry was that Carson, who must by now have made his own discovery about these girls, would decide they weren't worth bothering with. But a single glance at Carson's steadily smiling, talking face reassured him. Sitting tense at the tall girl's feet while she stood to towel her back in a way that made her breasts sway delightfully, Carson was plainly determined to follow through. "Look," he said, "why don't we all have dinner together? Then afterwards we might—" Both girls began chattering their regrets. They were afraid not. Thanks anyway. They were meeting friends at the hotel for dinner and actually ought to be starting back now, much as they hated to. God, look at the time. And they really did sound sorry. So sorry that Ken, gathering all his courage, reached out and held the warm, fine-boned hand that swung at the small girl's thigh as the four of them plodded back toward the bathhouses. She even squeezed his heavy fingers and smiled at him. "Some other night, then?" Carson was saying before you leave. "Well, actually," the tall girl said, "our evenings do seem to be pretty well booked up. Probably run into you on the beach again, though. It's been fun." "Goddamn little snot-nosed New Rochelle bitch," Carson said when they were alone in the men's bathhouse. "Shh! Keep your voice down, Carson. They can hear you in there." "Oh, don't be an idiot." Carson flung his trunks on the duckboards with a sandy slap. I hope they do hear me. What the hell's the matter with you? He looked at Ken as if he hated him. Pair of goddamn teasing little professional virgins. Christ, why didn't I stay in Paris? And now here they were. Carson glowering, Ken sulking at the sunset through fly-specked windows while a pushing garlic-smelling bunch of laborers laughed and shouted over the pinball machine. They went on drinking until long past the dinner hour. Then they ate a late, unpleasant meal together in a restaurant where the wine was corky and there was too much grease on the fried potatoes. When the messy plates were cleared away, Carson lit a cigarette. What do you want to do tonight? He said. There was a faint shine of grease around Ken's mouth and cheeks. I don't know, he said. A lot of good places to go, I guess. I suppose it would offend your artistic sensibilities to go and hear Sid's piano again. Ken gave him a weak, rather testy smile. You're still harping on that? He said. Sure, I'd like to go. Even though he may prostitute himself? Why don't you lay off that, Carson? They could hear the piano from the street, even before they walked into the square of light that poured up from the doorway of Sid's place. On the stairs, the sound of it grew stronger and richer, mixed now with the sound of a man's hoarse singing. But only when they were down in the room, squinting through the blue smoke, did they realize the singer was Sid himself. Eyes half closed, head turned to smile along his shoulder into the crowd. He was singing as he swayed and worked at the keys. Man, she's got a pair of eyes. The blue spotlight struck winking stars in the moisture of his teeth and the faint thread of sweat that striped his temple. I mean, they're higher than the summer skies, and when you see them, you're going to realize just why I love my sweet Lorraine. Damn, place is packed, Carson said. There were no vacancies at the bar, but they stood of the girls on the bar stools. Directly behind him was Jacqueline. Oh, he said. Hi. Pretty good crowd tonight. She smiled and nodded and then craned past him to watch Sid. I didn't know he sung, too, Carson said. This something new? Her smile gave way to an impatient little frown, and she put a forefinger against her lips. Rebuffed, he turned back and moved heavily from one foot to the other. Then he nudged Ken. You want to go or stay? If you want to stay, let's at least sit down. Shh. Several people turned in their chairs to frown at him. Shh. Come on, then, he said, and he led Ken sidling and stumbling through the ranks of listeners to the only vacant table in the room. A small one down in front, too close to the music and wet with spilled drink that had been pushed aside to make room for larger parties. Settled there, they could see now that Sid wasn't looking into the crowd at large. He was singing directly to a bored-looking couple in evening clothes, who sat a few tables away. A silver blonde girl who could have been a movie starlet and a small chubby bald man with a deep tan. A man so obviously Murray Diamond that a casting director might have sent him here to play the part. Sometimes Sid's large eyes would stray to other parts of the room or to the smoke-hung ceiling, but they seemed to come into focus only when he looked at these two people. Even when the song ended and the piano took off alone on a long, intricate variation, even then he kept glancing up to see if they were watching. When he finished to a small thunderclap of applause, the bald man lifted his face, closed it around an amber cigarette holder, and clapped his hands a few times. Very nice, Sam, he said. My name's Sid, Mr. Diamond, Sid said, but I thank you a lot just the same. Glad you enjoyed it, sir. He was leaning back, grinning along his shoulder while his fingers toyed with the keys. Anything special you'd like to hear, Mr. Diamond? Something old-time? Some more of the real old Dixieland? Maybe a little boogie. Maybe something a little on the sweet side. What we call a commercial number. Got all kind of tunes here waiting to be played. Anything at all, Sid, Murray Diamond said, and then the blonde leaned close and whispered something in his ear. How about Stardust there, Sid? Can you play Stardust? Well, now, Mr. Diamond, if I couldn't play Stardust, I don't guess I'd be in business very long. France or any other country. His grin turned into a deep false laugh, and his hand slid into the opening chords of the song. That was when Carson made his first friendly gesture in hours, sending a warm blush of gratitude into Ken's face. He hitched his chair up close to Ken's and began to speak in a voice so soft that no one could have accused him of making a disturbance. You know something? He said. This is disgusting. My God, I don't care if he wants to go to Las Vegas. I don't even care if he wants to suck around for it. This is something else. This is something that turns my stomach. He paused, frowning at the floor, and Ken watched a small, worm like vein moving in his temple. Putting on this phony accent, Carson said. All this big, phony Uncle Remus routine. And then he went into a little pop-eyed, head-tossing, hissing parody of Sid. Yes, sir, Mr. Diamond, sir. Would y'all would y'all like to hear, Mr. Diamond, sir? Got all kind of tunes just waiting to be played and yuck 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 and shut your mouth. He finished his drink and set the glass down hard. You know damn well he doesn't have to talk that way. You know damn well he's a perfectly bright, educated guy. My God, on the phone I couldn't even tell he was black. Well, yeah, Ken said, it's sort of depressing. Depressing? It's degrading. Carson curled his lips. It's degenerate. I know, Ken said. I guess that may be partly what I meant about prostituting himself. You were certainly right then. This is damn near enough to make you lose faith in the race. Being told he was right was always a tonic to Ken. And it was uncommonly bracing. Being told he was right was always a tonic to Ken, and it was uncommonly bracing after a day like this. He knocked back his drink, straightened his spine, and wiped the light mustache of sweat from his upper lip, pressing his mouth into a soft frown to show that his faith, too, in the race was badly shaken. Boy, he said, I sure had him figured wrong. No, Carson assured him, you couldn't have known. Listen, let's go then, Carson, the hell with him. And Carson's mind was already full of plans. They would stroll in the cool of the Croisette for a long, serious talk on the meaning of integrity, on how rare it was and how easily counterfeited, how its pursuit was the only struggle worthy of a man's life, until all the discord of the day was erased. But Carson moved his chair back, smiling and frowning at the same time. Go, he said. What's the matter with you? Don't you want to stay and watch the spectacle? I do. Doesn't it hold a sort of horrible fascination for you? He held up his glass and signaled for 2 more cognacs. Stardust came to a grateful conclusion and Sid stood up, bathed in applause, to take his break. He loomed directly over their table as he came forward and stepped down off the dais, his big face shining with sweat. He brushed past them, looking toward Diamond's table, and paused there to say, "Thank you, sir," though Diamond hadn't spoken to him before he made his way back to the bar. I suppose he thinks this, Carson said. Probably just as well, Ken said. I wouldn't know what to say to him. Wouldn't you? I think I would. The room was stifling, and Ken's cognac had taken on a faintly repellent look and smell in his hand. He loosened his collar and tie with moist fingers. Come on, Carson, he said. Let's get out of here. Let's get some air. Carson ignored him, watching what went on at the bar. Sid drank something Jacqueline offered and then disappeared into the men's room. When he came out a few minutes later, his face dried and composed, Carson turned back and studied his glass. Here he comes. I think we're going to get a big hello. Now, for Diamond's benefit, watch. An instant later, Sid's fingers brushed the cloth of Carson's shoulders. Bzz, bzz, he said. How are you tonight? Very slowly, Carson turned his head. With heavy eyelids, he met Sid's smile for a split second, the way a man might look at a waiter who had accidentally touched him. Then he turned back to his drink. Uh-oh, Sid said. Maybe I didn't do that right. Maybe I got the wrong shoulder. Here. I'm not too familiar with the rules and regulations yet. Murray Diamond and the blonde were watching, and Sid winked at them, thumbing out the IBF button in his lapel as he moved in, sidling steps around the back of Carson's chair. This here's a club we belong to, Mr. Diamond, he said. Barflies Club. Only trouble is I'm not very familiar with the rules and regulations yet. He held the attention of nearly everyone in the room as he touched Carson's other shoulder. Bzz, bzz. This time, Carson winced and drew his jacket away, glancing at Ken with a perplexed little shrug as if to say, Do you know what this man wants? Ken didn't know whether to giggle or vomit. Both desires were suddenly strong in him, though his face held straight. For a long time afterwards, he would remember how the swabbed back black plastic of the table looked between the 2 unmoving hands, how it seemed the only steady surface in the world. Say, Sid said, backing away toward the piano with a glazed smile. What is this here? Some kind of conspiracy here? Carson allowed a heavy silence to develop. Then, with an air of sudden, mild remembrance, seeming to say, "Oh, yes, of course," he rose and walked over to Sid, who backed up confusedly into the spotlight. Facing him, he extended one limp finger and touched him on the shoulder. Buzz, he said, does that take care of it? He turned and walked back to his seat. Ken prayed for someone to laugh. Anyone. But no one did. There was no movement in the room but the dying of Sid's smile as he looked at Carson and at Ken, the slow, fleshy enclosing of his teeth and the widening of his eyes. Murray Diamond looked at them, too, briefly. A tough, tan little face. Then he cleared his throat and said, How about Hold Me there, Sid? Can you play Hold Me? And Sid sat down and began to play, looking at nothing. With dignity, Carson nodded for the check and laid the right number of 1,000 and 100 franc notes on the saucer. It seemed to take him no time at all to get out of the place, sliding expertly between the tables and out to the stairs. But it took Ken much longer. Lurching, swaying in the smoke like a great imprisoned bear, he was caught and held by Jacqueline's eyes even before he had cleared the last of the tables. They stared relentlessly at the flabby quaver of his smile. They drilled into his back and sent him falling upstairs. And as soon as the sobering night air hit him, as soon as he saw Carson's erect white suit retreating several doors away, he knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to run up and hit him, with all his strength between the shoulder blades, one great chopping blow that would drop him to the street. And then he would hit him again, or kick him. Yes, kick him. And he'd say, God damn you, Carson. The words were already in his mouth, and he was ready to swing when Carson stopped and turned to face him under a street lamp. What's the trouble, Ken? He said. Don't you think that was funny? It wasn't what he said that mattered. For a minute, it seemed that nothing Carson said would ever matter again. It was that his face was stricken with the uncannily familiar look of his own heart. The very face he himself, Lord-ass Platt, had shown all his life to others. Haunted and vulnerable and terribly dependent, trying to smile, a look that said, Please don't leave me alone. Ken hung his head, either in mercy or shame. Hell, I don't know, Carson, he said. Let's forget it. Let's get coffee somewhere. Right. And they were together again. The only problem now was that they had started out in the wrong direction. In order to get to the Croisette, they would have to walk back past the lighted doorway of Sid's place. It was like walking through fire, but they did it quickly and with what anyone would have said was perfect composure. Heads up, eyes front, so that the piano only came up loud for a second or two before it diminished and died behind them under the rhythm of their heels.